All right, thank you everyone for, I'd like to thank the conference organizers here for their work putting together this conference and also the opportunity to present. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a group of fish that probably most of you have never heard anything about before, and these are the Buffalofishes. This is a group that has long been neglected, long been cast aside, and long been turned a blind eye to by fisheries management in the United States. But we're beginning to learn some really fascinating things about this group. And this group here has been basically it's a part of the North American diversity. There's so many things that we've recently discovered that I think could potentially give some quality insight into and potentially a model organism that could be studied here in the field of geroscience and gerontology. So what I'd like to do is begin just by going over a general overview for the talk, because since most of you have probably never heard of what these are, I'm going to first describe to you what the Buffalofishes are. Then I'm going to get into explaining a little bit about why their longevity is so exceptional, and then describe a little bit more about why they're such a valuable study system and why there's a need for study across more scientific disciplines. But unfortunately, to conclude, I'm going to be telling you why time is running out. And I'd like to also mention that when I first started studying this group several years ago, people used to literally ask me, why would you ever spend your time studying a group of fish like this? This fish has long been neglected. They've been treated basically like trash for many decades in the United States. And it speaks to, though, like as you'll learn, some of the most fascinating things that we have yet to understand often lie in these systems that people consider unfashionable, like we talked about earlier in this conference. So I hope that can be a lesson that we all can learn from some of the information you're going to learn today. So what are the Buffalofishes? So I just want to first present phylogeny. They're in the Cypriniformes order. They do share that order with carp species, but they are not carp. Many of you probably thought when you first saw them up there that, oh, it's just a big carp-looking fish. Well, they're not a carp. They're in a totally different scientific family. And you can see, for an example, the North American bigmouth buffalo on the top, and then an invasive common carp there, which is a widely invasive species around the world, on the bottom, just as an example. But basically, the point is they're not carp. So if you can learn one thing at the beginning of this talk, is that the buffalofish are not carp. It's a very common misconception, and they're so distantly related. It would be like if to confuse a carp as or a buffalo as a species of carp, it's like confusing a fellow human as a species of lemur, or they're that distantly related. But the Buffalofishes belong to this family of the suckers, this North American family of fish called the Catastomidae. And there are 80 total species in this group, 79 of which are native to North America. And this includes the suckers, the red horse, the Buffalofishes, quillbacks, and many more. I'm just going to go over a brief sort of overview of some of them here. But they exhibit a really broad range in maximum known lifespans, most of which we've only recently just discovered in the past 5 years, ranging from anywhere from 4 to 127 years. So this could potentially be a model group, much like we learned from Emma a couple talks ago with bats, in that there could be a lot that could be gleaned from this group. But you have other issues, though, with them, in that the majority of these catastomids, they are of conservation concern, and basically the rest they've been totally neglected, and we don't even know much about their sort of status, which is really unfortunate. And it basically gets back to sort of binning organisms into groups and treating certain fish as game fish, others as rough fish or coarse fish, and never paying any attention to them. Well, hopefully we can learn a lesson there. But one thing I'd like to highlight, though, is just there are many species in the three genera there highlighted on the left column. But there's a good range in lifespans. But for the Buffalofishes themselves, within the past 5 years, we found that all three of the USA species, the black buffalo, smallmouth buffalo, and the bigmouth buffalo, can easily attain centenarian status. And this is fairly remarkable because prior to this work, it was thought that this group only lived 10 to 20 years max. So it really defied the previous convention sort of understanding of the life history for this group. And I should mention, too, that there are 2 other species in the Ichthyobus genus, or the Buffalofishes group. Both are found in Mexico and Guatemala, but there is literally no age study or growth study on them, no age information at all. So a very new group that could be studied for all sorts of different longevity interests. But let's take a closer look at the big-mouthed buffalo. This is the oldest freshwater teleos, the oldest one in the group that we so far know of. They can reach ages up to 127 years, as we so far know. This is a group of more than 12,000 species. So the big-mouthed buffalo here can live more than 120 years. They're very slow to reach maturity. They take decades to sort of reach full maturity. They also accrue these unique pigmentation markings with age, which was never before documented prior to our work in 2019, even though, as you can see in this image, these are very vivid markings that can accrue on these fish, which are a direct sign of their age. They also exhibit pronounced asymptotic growth, sexual dimorphism, females at maturity being much larger than males at maturity. They also exhibit highly episodic recruitment, meaning that between successful generations in some systems, even though they might be reproducing every single year, they can have up to 50 years, even 60 years in between generations with no successful recruitment. So it's clear that they've evolved this really long lifespan as an adaptation to bridge these unfavorable gaps in environmental conditions that can occur in these highly variable freshwater systems. So because of that, and in part because we're still just learning so much about them, their age ceiling is still very much unknown, even though we already know they can live more than 125 years. And furthermore, we found in a study that was led by Dr. Derek Sauer, published back in 2021, that we found that they exhibit physiological improvements at 100 years old. I just want to, now that you've learned a little bit more about them, I want to highlight just some footage to give you an idea. Here, some big-mouthed buffalo were spawning, this video was taken not too long ago, but you'll see that they come into these shallow freshwater, or these shallow creeks and freshwater systems. There's a shallow lake off in the distance that doesn't get more than 3 to 5 meters deep, but they come into these shallow systems to spawn and lay their eggs on vegetation, and then hopefully their offspring will make it through the predation gauntlet. You're going to then see these individuals come back and actually go into a culvert. Here you can see their white lips coming through. There's a male on the left there, or on the female's right, and now they went into the culvert. And you'll see that there's some orange fins on that male. You can see it kind of waving there on the tail fin. And they're going to turn back around, and then some more males are going to bump up against the female, and they start crowding her. In this system, the median age of buffalofish, or the big-mouthed buffalo here, is 93 years as of 2024. They're fish up to about 118 in this system right now, and there's a huge gap after that. Here's just one more quick video showing some adults coming through, and you're going to see the male push the female kind of towards the surface, and she's going to turn her head's going to kind of turn towards the view of the camera here. But they're really docile, gentle giants of freshwater systems. One way that you can think of them is they're like the big-mouthed buffalo being a filter-feeding fish. They're like the ecological equivalent of a whale shark, or even like a baleen whale. So like these little mini freshwater whales you can think of swimming around in the lakes in Minnesota and throughout North America. But when they oviposit and lay their eggs, you can see them kind of on the vegetation here. They're really small. They might have high fecundity, but their egg size is incredibly small, only 1.1 to 1.5 millimeters in diameter. And within minutes, there's all these invertebrate predators. Like here you can see water mites quickly coming to the eggs to prey on them. And then there's a whole host of other predators, including hydra, which will consume the larval recently hatched buffalo offspring. So here's just yet one last video showing day-old big-mouthed buffalo flittering around in the water there. They're incredibly small, the size of a grain of rice, translucent, transparent. They start from very simple beginnings, and there's no parental care, nothing, but again, they can have incredible gaps in successful recruitment, so there's very low chances for offspring survival in many systems. So now that you know a little bit about what the buffalo fishes are, let's take a look at why their longevity is so exceptional. So, like I had mentioned before, and as you saw in the video, these buffalo fishes inhabit highly variable freshwater systems, but they're shallow water and warm adapted. Yes, they are larger bodied, but they're shallow water and warm adapted, which isn't typically something that's associated with an extremely long lifespan. So like as was mentioned in a previous talk earlier, like Colera et al. A few years ago studied the ocean rockfishes, and they found that the deep dwellers live significantly longer than the more shallow dwellers. Well, there might be something different going on here in terms of what might be underpinning their exceptional longevity genetically, because here it's a shallow water, warm adapted group. They're even in habitats that are prone to winter kill, yet still in some systems they're living easily past a century. So a winter kill where there's low oxygen and many could die out in a given system. And then I think another thing that speaks to their exceptional longevity is just how little we still know about them. So for example, in Canada, we had a first random sample of the population assessed was just 52 individuals. There was longevity more than 125 years, a median age of 80 years in this population in Saskatchewan. 13.5% of the population were supercentenarians. There's just so much more we still need to learn about these fish. And again, prior to 2019, they were thought to live only 10 to 20 years max. They were so neglected. What's more, these fish have a really incredible story to tell in terms of one case study. They were actually transplanted in the early 1900s into desert reservoirs of the American Southwest to potentially establish a commercial fishery in the region. And what we recently published in October of 2023 is that all three species of USA buffalofish, the black buffalo, the smallmouth, and the bigmouth, all have already demonstrated centenarian lifespans in that system. And evidence indicates that some of the original buffalo fishes that were stocked way back in 1918 are still alive in this system. And the median age of this, in this remote lake in Arizona, this reservoir lake, is 101 years as of 2024. And more than 90% of the individuals here, based on the evidence that we have, are more than 80 years old with a known age range of 11 to 108. So there, even though there's a vast majority are extremely old and they haven't recruited in a very long time, there's a lower end that's really young, so there's maybe a little blip of recruitment that happened recently. But basically, an incredible preponderance of centenarians here with a good age range to study from. And then finally, like in the video you saw in Minnesota, with this population, or several populations actually in northwestern Minnesota, where there's another high preponderance right now of like these mid-90-year-olds that are, and many of them which are already centenarians as well, with more than 85%, or around 85% of the individuals hatched pre-1939. Incredible episodic recruitment in these systems. And other areas of Minnesota, as we're studying, are showing similar trends with some exceptions. But basically, there's all these different studies that, or different systems that one could study from one of the longest lived vertebrates, and lots of potential options there. So let's just, maybe you've been thinking about how these could be valuable to some other questions, but let's just go over then some of the things I wanted to highlight regarding that, and also why there's a need for this study across more disciplines. So first, buffalofish, as you probably have been able to gather, they can be directly and readily aged from wild populations. So unlike some of the problems that might occur for some systems, like the difficulty, as Emma was explaining, to age wild bats, with fish, or at least otolith-bearing fishes, and otoliths are these ear stones, these calcium carbonate structures that most fish species have, they can be directly and readily aged by thin sectioning that structure and then quantifying the growth rings that happen each cold season or each winter. And this is much like aging a tree or a cross-section of a coral, but it allows for very definitive age estimates which can also be validated. So here you can see the progression in this 83-year-old individual on through the decades of this cross-section of its otolith. And this allows, like I mentioned, very precise age estimates. And in this particular otolith type, the cross-section kind of looks like an arcing clamshell. But not only that, point 2 in this section, the otolith-derived ages and the methodology that we've developed is validated. And it's also been validated across other studies too, independent, recently. And now there's also, I should mention, a much higher focus now on these fish, now that we've discovered these things across North America, because now everyone wants to find out how old the buffalofish are basically in their system. But what we did here is, and you can see on the y-axis, is we tested the validity of the age estimates in the otoliths, because initially this was met with skepticism because the ages were so far off the charts. We used bomb radiocarbon dating though to see if they lived through the nuclear bomb testing that occurred in the 50s and 60s that more than doubled the amount of C14 in the atmosphere. This got into the organisms that were alive at the time, and it shows up as a spike around the mid-50s to 60s as a time-specific marker that can be used to date organisms. And it's a well-established science around the world. And sure enough, what we found is that there's the spike and the fallout that you would expect. And it's consistent too, like if you read into the otolith literature, otoliths are the gold standard for age analysis of fish. And then a third point that I'd like to mention, and maybe you were thinking about based on some of the markings you saw on some of these fish, is that as they actually accrue these markings as they age, and they will very slowly accrue and intensify as they get older, but they can be used to actually identify individuals, and then if they're recaptured, if these fish are being captured in a non-lethal manner, they can be tracked longitudinally over time. And this has actually been demonstrated extremely well by a very enthusiastic catch and release angling community in Arizona, of all places, in a rugged desert. These really enthusiastic anglers who have caught literally centenarian bigmouth buffalo and other species and caught them multiple times. Like here you can see a male that was caught 4 times across a 13-month period, having the same markings each time. Here was another individual that was caught 6 times across a 4-year period. This presents an opportunity to potentially take samples across a longitudinal time frame in a very long-lived system, one of the longest-lived vertebrates that we have here. And just a few more examples, and it can also be done in the other buffalofish species. Like here's a smallmouth buffalo that was caught 4.3 years apart. And these minute little black markings were essentially unchanged, but are very good for identifying these individuals. And then a fourth point is that, as I mentioned, we found in Sauer et al. 2021 that bigmouth buffalo continue to improve in physiological systems as they age into their 80s and 90s. So not only are they less stressed, the evidence indicates they're less stressed as they get older, but also their immune, a measure of their innate immune system show that their immunity system is getting better. And also there is no evidence of telomere shortening with age across a century of ages. And this is an area that definitely needs to be further studied, because this is just a sort of an initial look at what there could be here, and we still don't know what the proximate mechanisms that underlie this negligible senescence are. So basically, like those individuals that you saw in the opening video, they're in prime condition. Even though they're in their mid-90s, they're just in great condition, still able to spawn, reproduce, do everything. And we don't understand how they can really do that. And there's so much more that could be studied with regard to that aspect. And then a fifth point that sort of wraps up many of these here is that, and I kind of already went over this, that there are these many different systems to choose from, because basically these buffalofish, they consistently are showing us now, just in the past 5 years, that they harbor some of the oldest vertebrate populations currently known in terms of like median age that are out there. So why is it though that time is running out, and unfortunately? You might be thinking, what's going on there? Well, it has to go back to the systemic neglect that I was telling you about at the very beginning. So there is a fisheries management overhaul that is required due to systemic neglect regarding this rough fish label, but basically because people have been trained, so to speak, even though it may have not been intentional, that these fish are nothing but garbage, people are going out now with this recently growing sport of night bow fishing and other things and targeting these fish in a lethal manner just for the sport of killing, and then piling fish by and large as waste. There's also growth and interest from other groups in these fish now, though, as we're learning more about them. And the thing about the bow fishing, though, shooting fish with a bow and arrow, is that it really only has recently grown in popularity in the past decade in the United States. So this is something that's a very new and novel threat on these systems, which means that this resource is being depleted, and there was already evidence that the buffalo fishes were declining in many systems before this happened. But overall, it just shows why we should be careful with how we label things, because otherwise it can lead to really big issues. So basically, just to give you an idea of this, people go out on the platforms, boats, and shining these bright lights at night and picking off fish in the shallows. But basically, it's a really effective method of getting fish because they're not used to that, obviously. And it leads to a lot of waste, and a lot of fish can be taken. So literally tons of fish can be taken in single outings. And just another thing that I wanted to point out is that they can get over 1,000 individuals in a single outing. So basically, there are many issues here, but there are opportunities to get samples, basically, too, while they exist. And there's also a lot of things that we still don't know about this group. But I hope that I've been able to show you why this is really important. And I wanted to also touch on this aspect because this kind of already occurred in a way in terms of the environmental dilemma, the conservation issue, because we almost drove the American bison to extinction in the 1870s through basically needless slaughter. So you'd think we would have learned from that. But I hope that now I've been able to explain to you a little bit about what the buffalo fishes are. You have a sense of why their longevity is exceptional, and there's still so much more to learn. And also how there's value to study more about them and a need for study across more disciplines. Because I'm a fisheries biologist from Minnesota, but there are many other questions that could be answered here. And I'd also like to point out again too, like hopefully you understand why there is a sort of a time-sensitive nature to if we want to understand more about them. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge many collaborators that I've worked with and references, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thanks so much, Alec. Absolutely fascinating story that I don't think any of us had ever heard until very recently. So thank you for doing this work and for bringing it to our attention. Any questions for Alec? At the back, in the center.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating, and I still don't understand exactly. But I will say what I think I understand, and you will correct me if I'm wrong. So the animals there, they don't reproduce, and it seems to be the reasons they don't age, in very short. But okay, more, why?
Yes, that is correct. There hasn't historically been much attention on these fish prior to like the past decade or so, but there's been some commercial fishing that's occurred in some localized systems here and there, some interest that has popped up here and there, but really it has just been in the past 10 years that this sport of shooting fish with a bow and arrow at night has really emerged as a thing that people want to do. And because these fish were classified in this rough fish category, people, and also they superficially may look like a different group, people might think that they're not even an integral part of the ecosystem or anything like that. So basically, management has been behind in the sense that they allowed a sport that they didn't have data for, which then emerged in popularity, and now people are targeting these fish just for the sake of killing them. Many of them think they're actually just shooting carp, but they're not. They're buffalo fish, as I mentioned. They're in a totally different scientific family. They have intrinsic and extrinsic value to the ecosystems. So yeah, it's definitely like one of the most low-hanging fruit conservation issues probably in the world right now, because it's really insidious actually what's going on. Just killing for the sake of killing in many instances.
All right.
Yeah, so I guess we do know so far that they don't show evidence of telomere shortening with age. So that might be one thing there. But in their immune function and other aspects of their physiology continue to improve even as they approach 100 years old. But we really don't know. But in terms of an evolutionary perspective or evolutionary answer, they have this incredible life history in that there can be decades and decades in between successful generations in some systems. So it's clear that they've evolved this really long lifespan as an adaptation to bridge those periods that can be really unfavorable for offspring recruitment. So they've likely evolved this incredibly long lifespan as an adaptation to bridge those gaps, which could be completely natural.
And they grow throughout their life, right?
So Yes, they're actually, they do exhibit asymptotic growth, but for the first several decades they're growing more rapidly. But there is evidence that they actually do continue to grow throughout their life, but it's really small. So like from age 50 to 95 years, for example, they're putting on a growth rate of 1 millimeter per year.
I see. Okay.
Hey, Alex, this is really, really cool. I have a question, and it's like the average age is really, really old, like 100 from your animals in Canada. So how it works from the point of view of replacement and reproduction? Because I understand that there is all these little bugs eating the little babies, but is any other way to control it? Because I don't understand the massive gap in young animals. So do you have any insight or what is happening there?
Yes, we do, and it likely largely has to do with recruitment failure from predation. So in many systems, these fish are spawning annually or mostly annually. So they're getting that opportunity to spawn, but the offspring just aren't making it through the predation gauntlet. So it's not only the invertebrates that are preying on the eggs immediately after oviposition, there's also piscivorous, or there's also fish that'll be consuming them and other things up the food web. But then another aspect though, like in Canada, for example, we found evidence that if the conditions aren't right environmentally, in some systems, like say if there's water level control, where the water levels have stagnated due to dams and fragmentation, they may simply forego spawning across some years because having such a long lifespan, that may have evolved as an adaptive trait as well, where they can simply forego spawning, which could be an additional explanation as to why there could be many years without successful recruitment.
All right. Thanks so much, Alec.
Yeah.